In the second part of this lecture series on how species diversify, we're going to talk about different types of radiations. Now, radiations is just a fancy term for speciation on a grand scale. So lineages diversifying into all sorts of different types. We talked in the first part of the lecture on the mechanisms, some of the things that can really promote adaptive diversification, and we're going to go into the different types of radiations. So not everything is about adaptation. We can have non-adaptive radiations. So basically the production of only a handful of species, maybe even only one species, that is very ecologically similar if you compare between pairs of species that in a particular radiation. Or we can actually have the production of many different species, but they're all very ecologically similar. So just think about a lineage that's diversifying across an island archipelago. We just have lots of different species that have just been diversifying through passive divergence. So they all are adapted to the same ecological niche. Adaptive radiations, on the other hand, are where natural selection has really sped up the process of diversification. So they've invaded new environments. So things like ecological opportunity can produce lots of different species, but perhaps not a lot of them, maybe only half a dozen, across different types of environments. So again, they're very ecologically diverse because each species has speciated because it's adapted to its own unique environment. Now, when there are lots of different environments, perhaps a whole continent with lots of different ecological niches, you can actually have the production of massive numbers of species that are all ecologically different from each other. So these things are when adaptation and natural selection has played a role in speciation and diversification. We term these adaptive radiations. Now, this is divergence of a phylogenetic lineage, so a common ancestor into many different adaptive forms, invading lots of different ecological niches. Speciation here is primarily the product of natural selection. Other processes can be at work as well. Passive divergence can also help in the whole process, but natural selection, adaptation is the primary thing forming those new species. Examples of adaptive radiations, the Darwin finches and the Galapagos are a classic example. They're probably not too species rich. Each of those islands has its own different species. Sometimes they're coexisting in the larger islands, but they have their own separate islands. Now, they've adapted to the particular food resources and other environments on these different islands in that archipelago. But as a radiation, they're not too diverse. We don't have a lot of different species here. We've got quite a few, maybe 10 to 12. But when it comes down to adaptive radiations, you can have substantially larger. Now, the ecological differences between here is all about that beak morphology. Beaks being important in the type of food resources, the seeds that these birds feed on. And you can see examples of really robust beaks really being basically nutcrackers, very fine beaks being particularly useful for very fine seeds and in some cases feeding on insects as well. An example of a very diverse and rich adaptive radiation are Hawaiian honey creepers. The same thing is going on here. We've got lots of adaptation in the beaks, but also a host of other features because of the different types of ecological niches that all these different birds occupy. They all originated from a common ancestor from the mainland, which is in grey in the middle there, and then they've radiated out into all these different ecological niches with lots of diversity in those bills that all reflect the type of resources, food resources that these animals, these birds are feeding on. It's not just animals, of course. Plants go through adaptive radiations as well, and the classic one are the Hawaiian silver swords. So Hawaii is definitely a hotspot for biodiversity, but also speciation and ecological research as a consequence. Now here we have a daisy-like shrub invading Hawaii historically and progressively moving off throughout the archipelago onto these different islands, and ultimately over a period of about 4 million years have formed 28 different species. Now that seems like a very long time, and that's a lot of species all from this single ancestor, but let's have a look at the variation, and this is just a handful. So we can see that from this very daisy-like ancestor, we've got a huge array of different types of species originating that look, frankly, alien compared to their ancestral phenotypes. So again, a wonderful example of adaptive radiation, again, primarily through natural selection, adaptations to particular environments, really accelerating that speciation engine. So the defining characteristics of an adaptive radiation, they originate from a common ancestor. So they come from a common starting point. So an initial invader, for example, into an island archipelago or into a diverse heterogeneous environment. There's a phenotype by environment correlation. So basically, these things are adapting to their specific ecological niche. So in the case of the Darwin finches, it's all about the beaks. In the case of the Hawaiian silverswords, it's a combination of morphologies, in particular the leaves in relation to the type of moisture environment that they're living in. So trait utility. So those changes in phenotype have to be adaptive. So the beaks allow these different species to feed on different seeds, or the leaves allow them to occupy different types of moisture environments. And then as a consequence of this natural selection really kickstarting the speciation process, we have this characteristic of rapid speciation as a consequence. So this is why evolutionary biologists really like adaptive radiations.